Hello, everyone. A very good evening, day, wherever you are. Thank you so very much for joining us for today's webinar. I see some familiar faces. Hello, everyone. Today's webinar is co-organized by two key organizations. One is the Rohingya Human Rights Initiative, Rohingya, and the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion, ISI. And we really want to take this time to welcome you and thank you for making the time to be with us this evening. We will be discussing some very key issues around humanitarian and protection issues of Rohingya refugees in India during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you have joined us for the first panel on protection issues concerning the Rohingya community in India. I'm going to start off by reading out a quote from a fellow activist, fellow Rohingya activist, who has requested me to read this. We Rohingya left our homes and country to save our lives. As India is one of the largest democracies in the world, we request authorities in India to help us by showing humanity. Detaining and harassing these already persecuted people is like punishing them again for being persecuted. And today we are really looking at the protection issues concerning the Rohingya community in India. As you all know, India is a temporary shelter and a place of refuge to one of the most persecuted communities and the largest stateless populations in the world, which is the Rohingya people from Myanmar. The Rohingya people have been denied citizenship in Myanmar for decades, and the discrimination and persecution against them are devastatingly pervasive. They are often targeted in violent and vicious attacks. A mass exodus of Rohingya women, children, and men was seen following a sweeping violence in Rakhine State in 2017, and that caught the world's attention. It was a military campaign marked with genocidal intent. Further deterioration on the protection on Rohingya refugees in India was seen happening from August 2017. In India, we see constant harassment, threats of incarceration, indefinite detention, and deportation. Some of these are seemingly targeted, and vulnerable communities who are most in need of protection are criminalized. We also see a surge of anti-Muslim rhetoric that has worsened during the time of the pandemic. Sometime in March, we have seen the authorities in Jammu and Kashmir detaining nearly 170 Rohingyas, sending them to holding center as part of verification process, raising the alarm on deportation and refoulement. And in June, we have seen massive fires, not the first one, it's the third one in the year, ripping across the camps, rendering hundreds who are already in dire need homeless in the Madanpur Khada settlement in Delhi. And in the recent days, we have seen severe intimidation of community leaders. We have seen crackdowns and community members being arrested and rearrested and detained. Just today alone, there were 3 people who were picked up in Uttar Pradesh. Rohingya refugees have faced deteriorating protection amounting to a humanitarian and human rights crisis. Legal status, systemic and systematic exclusion from documentation and basic services. And these are coupled by increasing harassments and detentions by authorities placed on the refugee communities in highly precarious positions. So again, today we are looking at protection issues concerning the Rohingya community in India. And with us, we have 3 panelists. We initially had 4, but unfortunately, one of the panelists could not join us for unforeseen circumstances. So therefore, I will give a brief introduction so that we can get acquainted with the panelists. One of the panelists is taking some time to join us this afternoon. So I will introduce the first panelist who will be a little late, and he sends his apologies. He's Colin Gonsalves. I think he's no stranger to many of you, especially those who are in India and advocating for communities who are vulnerable. He is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. Colin is a visionary and innovative human rights champion, especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable groups of people in India. He has actually co-founded the Human Rights Law Network, HRLN, building a national network with over 200 public interest lawyers and paralegals across India. So over 3 decades, the HRLN lawyers have engaged in public interest litigations to hold the government to account and secure a broad spectrum of human rights. And Colin has, of course, won numerous accolades over the years, including the Right Livelihood Awards in 2017 and the Mother Teresa Memorial Award in 2010, just to name a few. And he has, of course, written, edited, co-edited a copious number of articles and books on a range of human rights laws issues. So Colin has sent his apologies. He will be slightly late. We also want to introduce to you Meenakshi Ganguly, and she is here with us right now. And Meenakshi is the South Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, and she has been with Human Rights Watch since 2010. She is a fierce human rights defender with expertise on the South Asia region. She has worked in the region for close to a decade, or more than a decade actually. And prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Meenakshi served as the South Asia correspondent with the Time magazine. So she covered countries in South Asia like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, India. So she knows the region very well. And she has worked across a broad range of issues, including police reform, armed conflict, sexual violence, discrimination based on religion and caste, freedom of expression. In India in particular, she has researched abuses surrounding the sectarian riots in Gujarat, issues around religious freedom, the failure of India protecting the vulnerable communities, including those affected by the Maoist conflict, and also abuses related to the fighting in the states of Manipur, Jammu and Kashmir. So she has also advocated for the protection of women, of children from violence, including sexual abuse, and for a human rights approach to India's foreign policy. So that's Meenakshi. And our third and final panelist is Amal Dicicurau, and he is with ISI, who is also the one of the co-organizers of this event. And Amal is actually one of the co-directors in ISI, and he leads the Institute's human rights engagement work. He plays a very critical role in the Institute's work around childhood statelessness, gender discrimination, and the Institute's engagement with civil society and also the arts. Yes, there's a creative side to Amal. Amal is also a founding member actually of Stages, which is a Sri Lankan theatre group. So before co-founding the Institute, he actually provided the lead on the Equal Rights Trust's statelessness work. He was also one of the co-founders of the European Network on Statelessness. And of course, Amal is also a human rights lawyer and a member of the Sri Lankan Bar. And he is actually based in London. And before I invite the first speaker, I would actually want to also introduce Rohingya, or the Rohingya Human Rights Initiative. So Rohingya, for those of you who are not familiar, it's a local non-governmental non-profit organization that is formed by a group of young, fierce Rohingya activists in New Delhi. It was actually formed in 2017 and registered with the government as a public charitable trust in the same year. So these are a group of committed people, committed young people who are working with a vision and very selflessly promoting human rights and with the passion and solidarity to ensure the access to rights for people who are most vulnerable. So they have been advocating for their community as well. So I would like to just quickly check, Meenakshi, if you are ready, because we are still waiting for Colin to join us.
Sure.
That would be great. I have also dropped the document in the chat for you to see the profiles of the speakers if you would like. Okay, Meenakshi, so I would pass the time now to you, and you have about 10 minutes. You can start whenever you're ready.
Hello. All set? Thank you so much for organizing this meeting and for having me join. We are meeting at a time when we are seeing another refugee crisis break out on the western side of India. We are, I think many Indians are shocked, many people around the world are shocked at the scale of tragedy that's playing out in Afghanistan as people try to flee, fearing the kind of violence that they expect could come with the new regime. And the reason I flag that is because a lot of what happened to the Rohingya 4 years ago in August 2017, so literally four years ago from the time that we're speaking now, has been was played out in some amount of secrecy. There weren't independent observers. There wasn't anyone. The reason that we even knew some of this was happening initially was because we were able to use satellite images to see that there were village after village were on fire. And then, of course, we saw the spate of people coming across, streaming across the border to Bangladesh. The scale of tragedy that happened then and the fear that we are seeing right now in Afghanistan also occurred in Rakhine State, in northern Rakhine State in 2017. It just wasn't on your TV screens, on our TV screens. Therefore, it is important as India takes some positive steps towards trying to support Afghans who are in who are in need, to also remember that the Rohingya are equally in need of support and protection. Now, a number of Rohingya in India started coming even before 2017. Some of the people came during previous rounds of violence that had occurred 2012, 2015, 2017. As you just heard, the Rohingya have been been victims of discrimination and attacks and violence in Myanmar for quite some time now, and have been repeatedly forced into refugee conditions. We have seen the boats that have set out on the Bay of Bengal for decades now. Many of them capsize. These are all people who are trying to find a safest place where they can be before they can go back home. The one thing that is very important to flag is that I have never met a Rohingya refugee who doesn't say they want to go back home. So for a lot of the discourse that I'm just going to discuss in India, I think the first thing to recognize is that the Rohingya people in India or in Bangladesh or in Malaysia or in Indonesia or anywhere else are refugees who have the right to safe, voluntary, dignified return. And that is on Myanmar to make sure that that happens. But until that happens, until those conditions exist, host countries do have the responsibility to provide protection. UNHCR has a responsibility to provide protection, and governments have the responsibility, whether they've signed the Refugee Convention or not. One of the arguments that the Indian government, for instance, flags, they still have the responsibility under international law to protect refugee communities, including the Rohingya. Now, briefly to speak about the targeting of Rohingya in particular in India, which has been quite shocking. Now, refugee communities around the world, this is not just India, you see this in Europe, we see the the ill treatment towards irregular migrants. Under the COVID situation, we see the lack of vaccination or protection for refugee communities is playing out across the world. But that said, there is a particular kind of discriminatory targeting and stigma that is attached to the Rohingya community in India. And that is linked to a large part of the political environment that India is witnessing right now, a political environment where all too often rhetoric against Muslims has become part of the political discourse. It is something that the ruling party, supporters of the ruling party, even leaders of the ruling party right now, the BJP, have used. And that same rhetoric, unfortunately, is also being used to target the Rohingya in an extraordinary sort of way, which is that we have been told it comes up in the worst, playing to the worst kind of fears of host communities, which is that they are all violent. The idea that the Rohingya people are the Rohingya refugees in India, 40,000 according to government estimates, possibly more, are somehow a security risk, is something that has been played up by ruling party leaders and supporters, and it is something that is now seems to have become ingrained in the public discourse. So instead of seeing them as people that are a persecuted community that need the sympathy, the public sympathy and support, we repeatedly find, for some reason, a stigmatization of the Rohingya community, which is impacting the protection of their rights, even within in the public sphere. As far as state policy is concerned, there have repeatedly been attempts to deport people. There have been people who have been arrested and been held in holding centers. There was even recently the people who were protesting in front of UNHCR were picked up. So there is also the concern of this sort of indiscriminatory attacks, indiscriminate arrests and detentions that are going on right now, which require legal protection. The Rohingya have the right to legal protection, and that should be accorded to them. And the last thing that I want to say is India has the responsibility to not return people to a place where they will be at risk. This is international law. Since February, the Myanmar military, which is the one that targeted the Rohingya community so viciously, has taken office in a coup, has deposed the elected government. So, and in these circumstances, the very perpetrators of these attacks are now in charge, which has created further fear within the Rohingya people, and in the way that they fear that they cannot go back home. So to deport them in these circumstances is violation of India's international obligations. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi, and thank you for reiterating the critical point that India has the responsibility to not return people at risk. And we indeed have seen security risks being played up and ingrained in the public discourse, and we will want to perhaps explore that a little bit more a little later about the narratives that has been going on, that has been put forth that influence the public opinion. And you're right in saying that I myself also have not met a Rohingya who did not say that they do not want to go home. So ensuring the rights on a dignified, safe return is absolutely critical. So thank you so much for bringing those points. I would like to now invite Amal. I am not sure if, I think Colin is not with us yet, yeah?
No.
Amal, perhaps you would want to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rachel, and also for the very kind introduction before. And thank you, Meenakshi, for setting out so clearly the context and the situation in India. I would also like to extend my gratitude and thanks to our Rohingya partners in India who are operating under immense pressure right now. And really, this is a moment of impending crisis. And it's a moment where the situation is likely to deteriorate very rapidly. And so it's very urgent that the world's eyes also remain on India during this time, and we are able to witness what's happening and protect our Rohingya partners and colleagues and try and ensure that the worst possible outcome is averted. So what I would like to do is also contextualize what's happening in India a little more broadly with our experiences as ISI in kind of engaging on the rights of stateless people, the rights of stateless refugees, and indeed the Rohingya community themselves around the world. But before I do that, I would just like to flag two publications which have both come out very recently over the last month or so, and which speak specifically to the focus of our attention at today's event. The first is a report published very recently. It's called Failure to Protect, the Denial of Status, Detention and Refoulement of Rohingya Refugees in India. And this briefing paper, which was published earlier in August, is based on first-hand information, field research, as well as desk research conducted in India. And it really maps out in a very concise and accessible way some of the challenges that we're talking about. And the second is the Together We Can report, which is a publication of a consortium of organizations from around the world, including ISI and including Rights for Rohingya, which focused on the COVID-19 impact on stateless people around the world. And this report also focuses on the specific impact that the Rohingya communities in India, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Bangladesh have endured. And the whole report is rather large, but there's also a separate chapter on the Rohingya context, which has also been published separately. It's just a few pages. And I would recommend that you have a look at that as well. I think I would also like to start where Meenakshi started, actually, by reflecting on the genocide of 4 years ago. So next week, on the 25th of August, we will be commemorating the 4th anniversary of the culmination, I would say, of a long-term, multi-decade series of structural persecution, violence, and genocidal acts committed by the Myanmar state and by other actors in Myanmar against the Rohingya community. And it's within this context of many, many decades of persecution, crimes against humanity, and genocide that the Rohingya have endured that we need to reflect on their treatment in countries like India, where they have fled in order to seek safety and refuge. And as Meenakshi said, most Rohingya you speak to would be very clear that they want to go back to their home, and their home is Myanmar. The problem is they are unable to go back to their home right now. And certainly the conditions of a dignified return based on equality, based on being recognized as citizens of Myanmar, which they're entitled to, and based on having access to their rights, is something which at the moment, particularly given the very volatile context in Myanmar as well, it's not something which is going to happen very soon. And so you see the Rohingya, like many other refugee communities, stuck in this status of indefinite and enforced irregularity, where they are intentionally kept on the margins of society, denied a legal status, and then viewed through the criminal lens, through the security lens, as a result of that denial of legal status to them. In other words, you have states which have obligations to protect, which emerge both from humanitarian principles, but also from human rights principles, and which ignore these obligations to protect, and then penalize the very community that they should have protected for the consequences of their failure to protect them. And it is this situation which we see play out over and over again, whether it is India or Malaysia or other countries, where Rohingya are not provided a legal status, they are not provided the ability to legally work, to educate themselves, to fend for themselves, and then they are always on the margins of society, on the margins of legality, vulnerable to being picked up, to be detained, to be subject to removal proceedings, which in the context of the Rohingya would violate international law, given the situation in Myanmar, and in various extremes of precarity. And so we need to scrutinize why it is that communities like the Rohingya are kept in this place, this position of extreme precarity between the law and between what is legal and what is illegal. To whose advantage is it to perpetuate this lack of status, to perpetuate this continued dependency on UN agencies and humanitarian organizations, to perpetuate this inability, structural inability through structural discrimination, to stand up for themselves and live in dignity. And you would find in most contexts, not in all contexts, but in most contexts, where migrant communities, refugee communities, stateless communities are treated in this way, that it is to the advantage of those in power, or at least to certain segments of those in power. And as Meenakshi again alluded to, this is something we see in Europe, this is something we see in many other continents and regions of the world. The idea of scapegoating stateless people or migrants or refugees and kind of using them as a distraction to cover up your own failings as the political leaders of a country. It's a very easy, popular strategy. And unfortunately, it's a strategy which is gaining a lot of traction and has gained a lot of traction over recent years. And so we see this buildup of hate speech and xenophobia towards the Rohingya. We see this undermining of their humanity and this building of completely unfounded narratives of them being either criminal threats or security threats in order to justify treatment of the Rohingya, which actually falls outside the law. And what those of us who are neither refugees nor stateless people nor migrants perhaps are slow to recognize is that in this kind of situation, what is ultimately happening is also a much deeper, longer term erosion of the rule of law, erosion of democratic institutions, which serves the ultimate purposes of people with authoritarian and populist ambitions. So we have this very vicious cycle of the general public or the majority community being pitted against minorities, being pitted against stateless people, in this context being pitted against the Rohingya. And based on the rising kind of hate speech and hatred and anger and fear of these communities, certain executive and administrative actions being ignored or being played down or being tolerated because these actions are directed at this particular community, but all along these actions serve an additional purpose of eroding the very institutions which have been established to hold our political leaders to account. And we see this cycle of erosion of democratic institutions, of targeting minorities, of targeting migrants and refugees in a number of countries around the world. If you speak to someone in the Dominican Republic, if you speak to someone in Kuwait, if you speak to someone in Madagascar, or in Kenya, or indeed in the UK or the Netherlands, this analysis would resonate with people in various continents and various contexts around the world. And so it is really important for those of us who are interested in protecting human rights and promoting human rights to shift our focus to those who are most maligned, most marginalized, and most dehumanized by those in positions of power. Because it is at those peripheries that the attacks on our democracies begin. And there's no clearer example than what's happening in India right now. And so I don't want to get into too much detail in terms of the specificities of the eroding protection situation of the Rohingya. As I mentioned, this report that I spoke about, it goes into that in great detail. And no doubt Colin, who would come in and speak after me, would also speak with much greater clarity and authority than I ever can on the specific context in India. But I think what is important and what I have to offer is this wider reflection of what's happening globally, and the fact that if we are blind to this and if we don't recognize that our humanity and our dignity is connected, and this is perhaps the greatest lesson that COVID-19 can teach us, that everyone has to be made safe in order for everyone to be safe. And that we cannot go along under this pretext that it's okay to live in an unequal society, to treat people from particular minority communities or with migrant backgrounds differently, because that doesn't impact on our rights. Ultimately, whether it's a public health issue like COVID-19 or whether it's a human rights issue, the treatment of everyone is what reflects the strength of a democracy, the morality of a society, and indeed our collective dignity as human beings. So I would like to stop there. And I'd be very happy to engage in conversation with all of you in the Q&A session, which follows as well. But also with a final word that, as I started, the situation in India is definitely one of grave concern, and it's a situation which has been evolving over a number of years now. And it is I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to speak about these issues today, and I hope we are able to maintain our focus on these issues and be available to address them as and when the situation further evolves. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Amal. I really would like what you said, that the treatment of people, minority. Sorry, Fazal. Yeah. The treatment of people actually is a reflection of the strength of democracy and our humanity, and in reflection of what's happening with COVID, that no one is really safe until everyone is. And we can see how the situation is really ubiquitous, whereby across the region, vulnerable communities are denied of the basic rights and living in constant fear due to the lack of status. And to some extent, they are used as political tool to serve the ambition of populists, and minorities are targeted. So thank you so much for those reflections. With that, I'm very happy to to say that Colin Sir is now with us, and he's with Fazal, I think. Hello, Colin Sir. So I will now invite him to speak next. You have to unmute.
Yes. Good evening, Rachel. Good evening, Tapan. Good evening, Shabir. Good evening, Ali Johar. I'm sorry, I'm a little late. Do you want to speak me to speak in Hindi or English?
Do we have a Hindi interpreter? Amal and
No,
team?
I can speak whatever you want me. Hindi, I'll do Hindi. If the participants are Hindi speaking, I'll do Hindi. If they are not, then I'll do English, whatever you say.
Yeah, I think versatile is one word that was used to describe you. I think English is okay. Thanks so much, Colin, for that option.
No, I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry I'm a little late. I left Delhi to come to West Bengal, and I'm now in Siliguri. And I'm happy to see my friend Tapan in my screen, as large as life. And to my right is my colleague Fazal, who's also active on Rohingya issues in the Human Rights Law Network. So I've come to Siliguri to open our office here in Siliguri, particularly with the tea garden workers. The situation as far as the litigation is concerned is at a very delicate position. It is not so much in a dangerous position as it possibly was a little while ago, but the potential of danger is always looming over us. The matters, as you all know, were taken to the Supreme Court prior to the COVID period. And in that period, there were some very interesting exchanges in court. And in the court exchanges, ultimately, the Supreme Court judges asked the Solicitor General of India not to take any precipitous step as long as the proceedings are going on. To which the Solicitor General agreed, And he was arguing very ferociously, one, that they have no rights. Two is that India is becoming like a refugee center in this part of the world, and that is not acceptable. Three is that there are many criminals among the Rohingyas. Four is that the state has the right to evict them at any time, and they don't have any obligation. And fifth, that the UNHCR has no business or no basis, legal basis in India. Sixth, international law has no relevance to India. And he cited an old judgment of the Supreme Court, Louis Deret. And Louis Deret is a judgment which says that the state has absolute power in deciding who stays and who goes. But that is in the context of people who come, not refugees, but people who come and overstay their visa and so on. And Louis Deret said, I want a direction to the government to grant me an extension of visa or a visa or something like that. So that was not a refugee case. So it's a very bold statement. And I must say, from all the reactions that I've heard over time, because we did a number of cases in the High Court, for example, the High Court cases of the persons from Myanmar. And there was a classic case of a couple that was said to be found with narcotics and so on. And even there, the High Court judge said, Dom Young Khan, I can't pronounce it really, but that was a wonderful case because he said the principle of no refuma has attained the status of just cogens, that is to say a principle of law that no state can say we don't follow, we don't accept and so on. And notwithstanding the severity of the offense, he directed the government to work out an arrangement for their deportation from India to a country of their choice abroad. So that worked out pretty fortunately, given the charges of drug peddling and so on. And that's a beautiful judgment of the Delhi High Court, where it summarizes the law in respect of refugees. And I must say there are at least 3 or 4 or 5 very important judgments, Kerala High Court, Guwahati High Court, etc., that have given beautiful judgments on the rights of refugees. But times are changing. And now this government is like, what do you say? I mean, how do I say? A very despotic government, to put it mildly. And their attitude towards people of a certain ethnicity is very hostile. And so now, again, after many years of winning small battles here and there, we have atrocious arguments being made in court. At that time, I forget who was the Chief Justice who granted this kind of temporary relief to us. But anyway, who was it? Deepak Mishra. Deepak Mishra sort of understood the arguments made. He didn't want to allow them to be deported. And so there was a kind of a, if you like, a temporary kind of stalemate. But the judges changed. And now when the matters came in court again, the Solicitor General very boldly said that he made no statement of the sort. And I said I was present, and he did make an oral assurance. And in the Supreme Court, once one makes an oral assurance, one doesn't go back on it and deny it. But these are different times with different kind of government council. And no real rules, regulations, ethics, morality. It's like a battlefield in which now the Rohingyas are caught in the battlefield now in India. Anyway, the law is very clear. We all know that the law is very clear. The right not to be returned is ingrained in Article 21. Apart from the High Court judgment, there's also Khudiram's case and another case of the Supreme Court. So it's ingrained in that. And we don't really need to sign the convention at all. That argument went on endlessly. And there were a number of TV debates on whether you have to sign the convention to be bound by the convention and so on. And we don't need that because the gramophone company case of the Supreme Court said India must march in tune. Lovely observation. India must march in tune with its international obligations. And Vishaka also incorporates international obligations in your Article 21, which is the right to life. And we had the Home Minister coming up and making all kinds of awful statements that, we have an absolute right to return them. And then we showed them the Ministry of Home Affairs circular, which fortunately we managed to get, which clearly distinguishes between refugees and economic migrants. And economic migrants come under a regime where the state has a great deal of leeway in pushing them back. But refugees are clearly covered by the principles enunciated not only in our constitutional law, but in the circular of the MHA instead. The MHA is the Ministry of Home Affairs. And that circular says that if the refugee establishes that he or she has fled persecution, then our policy will be to give them long-term visas and extend and extend and extend from time to time. So the very documentation of the Home Affairs Ministry itself is to a sizable extent in our favor. Then time passed, and like I said, new judges came on the bench, and Justice Gogoi, who came as Chief Justice, is not particularly known for his affinity towards people who come into India. He comes from Assam. And I must say, some of his observations and judgments on NRC and CAA were very unfortunate. And as you know, the judgments in Longowal 1, Longowal 2 were judgments that spoke of outsiders coming in. But this is in the context of the minorities, Muslims particularly coming in to Assam, were very the kind of statements that you would expect the BJP to make, not the statements to come from a court. That this is invasion, this is a foreign invasion, and a time will come when they will ask that Assam, parts of Assam should be broken away and merged with Bangladesh. Can you imagine this kind of nonsense being written in a judgment of the Supreme Court? So Justice Gogoi, while he was there, Prashant took a case before him when 6 Rohingyas were threatened with deportation. And he took a case, we intervened in that case, there were a number of advocates. And I'm sorry to say, but that case was bulldozed by the government saying they've consented. It's a voluntary repatriation. And we said that voluntary repatriation, it might be, but the court must be satisfied that it's voluntary. People must have access to these persons to make sure that it is voluntary. And if indeed it is voluntary, then there's no doubt that they can be asked to go, whatever, or they can be facilitated in their going. But we were given no chance at all. And on the basis of the Solicitor General's statement, which we've not been able to determine even till today, because we have no contact, I think, with these 6 persons. The court just said, no, nothing doing. We're not going to hear any of you. And we are going to allow the deport. So 6 Rohingyas were sent back. God knows how many have actually, apart from these 6. But that phase of the war, let's say, that battle was lost with 6 persons being deported. Now we are in a very delicate situation because the hearing is going to start again. But if it comes before the Chief Justice's court, which is Chief Justice Ramana, who is he's somewhat of a refined justice. And I think if it comes before his bench, I think he might give us a good hearing, because we really need to finalize by a judgment of the Supreme Court what really are the rights of refugees. We don't need to really get it a very profound judgment and so on. If we can have a holding operation where the refugees are not deported, that's good enough, because practicality is more important than an enunciation of law. But it might be that the issue will come up again, and hopefully soon. In any case, now with the developments in Myanmar, it looks quite remote as a practical thing that deportations will be done. One. In the meanwhile, we filed a series of petitions on the economic rights of the Rohingyas. And we went to the camps where they were staying, and we found they had no drinking water. The women had no assistance at all. Pregnant women, lactating mothers had no assistance at all. The children were not allowed in schools, saying that no, schools are meant for Indian children, you're not an Indian child, etc., etc. And the PDS food that any human being is entitled to get, because Article 21, as you know, of our Constitution covers citizens and non-citizens alike. No one can say you're not a citizen, therefore you can't get food, education. So, but it's never been determined, and they've always been denied. It's such a strange thing, and the law is not determined, and the law is clear, but no one has given a specific judgment saying all refugees in our country have a right to food from the ration shops, education in the schools, admission in the hospitals, etc., etc., and safe drinking water, among the other basic rights of every human being. So those petitions came up, and the Solicitor General there made a statement which was recorded by the court that Rohingyas will have the same rights, economic rights, as Indian citizens. Now this, to a lawyer's brain, it seems quite an interesting statement to make, which was recorded. But as usual, a lawyer may think that it's a fantastic victory, but the people on the ground will think nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. And so those petitions now will come up to ensure that every person gets basic economic rights, not only in accordance with the Constitution, because it requires basic things for life to be ensured, foreigner or not, refugee or not. And we need to get that judgment so that what we thought was a good thing to have that statement recorded turned out to be a hollow victory because it was not implemented. And now we are moving applications to say that that assurance was never implemented. So that's the other trajectory. Is there anything else I'm forgetting? No, the right to petitions. And then in different parts of the country, but I believe my colleague Fazal is talking a little later in this session, a series of petitions have been done in Jammu, then they've been done in Hyderabad, Haryana, Delhi, etc. So and recent post connection with those groups, we're able to try and ensure that those orders are implemented properly. I must say, although I've talked very positively about certain developments, the situation is very negative, very despairing, very demoralizing, terrible situation. And I would welcome my colleague Shabir and others who are present here, and Ali Johar, who's present here. I would frankly like a closer collaboration on many things. And if we have made any mistakes from our side, we are truly sorry. If we have not been as active as you expected us to be, but we are very keen, and there's been an expansion of our network in terms of lawyers in certain places. In West Bengal, where we are now, the expansion has taken place and young lawyers have joined. And we could put you in touch with them directly, so you're at liberty to catch them at any time and ask them to do cases. But West Bengal release of Rohingyas has been okay, but there's a complication in the situation. But quite a few have been released in West Bengal or Assam. West Bengal, whatever, but it's not been as good as we expected it to be. Assam also has gone through an expansion, so we have a lot of young lawyers, and we have lawyers from the minority community who can empathize very immediately with the cause of the Rohingyas. We've been engaging in battles with Subramaniam Swami and other members of the far right. Yeah, and other members of the far right, on whether we have rights or not. But I think our arguments, not just mine, but the arguments of those doing these kind of cases is so decisive, and the argument is so incisive that most of the appearances on television where they came and said, you have no rights, we can deport you at any stage, etc., etc., etc. That seems to have stopped, at least on Indian television, that seems to have stopped for the time being. They've turned to other enemies, so-called enemies of the state. And of course, the argument on statelessness, and I'm saying this very important, that this case is now squarely before the Supreme Court. Right? But in the context of the situation in Assam, stateless persons cannot be kept in detention camps. And that petition now will come up for hearing, that you must close down your detention camps. Stateless people cannot be detained as long as you don't have a deportation date in the foreseeable future. And there is no deportation possible. Stateless persons have an affinity to no state. No state will accept them. Therefore, stateless persons must be released immediately. There was a 3-year limit. If you do 3 years, you get released. Then in the Supreme Court, we took out an application that was reduced to 2 years. Now we have an application saying reduce that to 2 months. And now we are saying that stateless persons should never be kept in jail. You can have reporting requirements, like they report to the police station once in a month or so on, but no more detention of stateless person. And that petition is coming before the Supreme Court. Thank you very much, my friends. I'm sorry I was late.
Thank you so much.
And on the Afghan situation, I just take a minute more. The Afghan situation is, of course, very critical. And we had a meeting with some of the Afghan refugees who are settled in India for a long time. It's very critical. And let me say this, we need the UNHCR in India.
Colin, have we lost you?
Changed. The old attitudes have changed. First of all, everyone in India, every single Afghan refugee, the old system of needing to stay in India for 12 years, then you make a kind of application, then you pay the FRRO. Yesterday, we heard all these stories again. You pay the FRRO huge sums of money, to get all your documents processed. This is a war. And now, if there was any ambiguity as to what the UNHCR must do, now it is crystal clear that the UNHCR must change its policy in view of the new situation of war, settle all the Afghans, make them pay nothing. And this whole e-visa system, again, yesterday we heard that the Indian government's e-visa system is getting to be a bit of a farce, because when they applied and they were told, all right, we'll answer after 72 hours or we'll answer after 1 week and so on. So all this rubbish procedures when there's a war going on and you have to save lives immediately by drastic measures is just not acceptable. It's just not acceptable. So I suppose we'll need to put our heads together and figure out. We have to, of course, look at the Indian government separately, see what can be done in terms of the Indian government and what pressure through the courts can be brought on the Indian government to actually do what they say. They say we want to settle, we want to save their lives. But are they really? And people are lined up in Afghanistan and their lives are in danger. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colin, sir. That is actually a very profound reflection, and I particularly like what you have said about practicality being more important than the enunciation of law. And thank you so much for taking us through the development over time about the legal recourses and the interventions, and about and reflecting how different times and different government councils actually shows that there's no real rules, and the Rohingyas or the most vulnerable communities are often caught in the battlefield. And thank you for also highlighting that basic rights is to be accorded to all, drawing from foundational documents like the Constitution. And there is a need for us to change with time. And you have brought up the need for UNHCR to change its policies. I am very conscious of the time. I wish that we have more time for this session, but there are two questions in there, one for Amal and one for Meenakshi, but I'm afraid, Tejal, we have run out of time for those questions. We do encourage you to reach out to the panel speakers if they are willing to share their contact details to follow up on the questions. We do have to prepare for the next panel. I just want to take this time to thank everyone for being present. Thank you so much to the panel speakers for sharing such profound insights. And also, we would say that this is not the only conversation we would have. It's perhaps an initiation that we can take forward. So thank you so much, everyone, for making the time. We will now close this session and we will prepare for the next panel. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Rachel.
Thank you so much,
Bye-bye,
Meenakshi.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Colin.
Hello. Yes. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, very clearly so.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to this session on humanitarian panel, which is following Colin Gonzalez and others panel. I think this is going to be very interesting panel. I joined a little late, but I heard what Colin said about the whole issue, the gamut of issues he discussed, legal issues. This is, I think, will be both legal and humanitarian, and how law can be used to have some humanitarian policies formulated by the government, not only the government, but for NGOs, for international agencies. So this panel is going to be both in the tune of human rights activism and legal activism. So both of them coming together would make this panel very interesting. Let me introduce myself. I am Biswajit Mohanty. I teach political science in Deshbandhu College and an associate professor in Deshbandhu College. I welcome Mr. Tapan Kumar Bose, Dr. Priyanka Mathur, and Advocate Fazal Abdali for this session. Welcome, sir and ma'am. And Advocate Fazal Abdali. Just let me introduce all the speakers, and after that, I invite all our speakers to spend 20 minutes each, and followed by discussion. Our first speaker is Mr. Tapan Kumar Bose, who is an independent documentary filmmaker, human rights and peace activist, author, and regular contributor leading journals and news magazines in India, Nepal, and Pakistan. He has done extensive research on issue of forced migration, lack of institutional protection for refugees, and statelessness in South Asia. He has authored several books, monographs, and articles on issues of forced migration, a lack of institutional protection for refugees, and statelessness in South Asia, and on the failure of the states and society to protect religious and other minorities in the countries of South Asia. His award-winning documentaries on human rights and democratic issues include an Indian Story, 1982, on the blinding and under-trial prisoners by police in Bhagalpur and nexus between landlords, police, and Politicians and Beyond Genocide, Bhopal Gas Tragedy, 1986. These are two documentaries. He was the Secretary General of South Asia Forum for Human Rights, a unique public forum in South Asia for regional dialogues, advocacy campaigns, teaching, and research. He is the co-founder of Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy in 1994. The other media, founder president of Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group, Kolkata, member of Board of Trustees of Equal Rights Trust, London, and South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center. He's an active member of Citizens Initiative on Kashmir since 1990s. With this introduction, I invite Mr. Tapan Kumar Bose to analyze the situation and discuss, followed by discussion. Sir, please. Sir, could you just unmute yourself?
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Tapan sir.
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that, Vichudit subjected you to such a long introduction. It only shows that I've been around for a long time. See, Colin and Meenakshi in many ways have told us the situation of the Rohingyas in India. Colin has also explained how difficult it has become to get clear legal judgments on this issue. I have personally been involved in the refugee protection issue in this country since 1988, actually. My involvement began with the young boys who had come hijacking an aircraft, you remember, in 1988 from Rangoon to Calcutta. And they were arrested. They were the young students of from participant in the 1988 uprising against the army rule in then Burma, now Myanmar. We formed a small group, Friends of Burma, and we realized that a large number of them were actually coming in into the Northeast, Mizoram, Manipur. While in Mizoram, because of their ethnic, relationship, these are all Zo people, whether it's Mizo or Chins. It's a British colonial, policy which has divided the Mizo Hills, which is called Lusai Hills, and the Upper China. So they've given them different names, cookies, Zo, etc. Mizo is also part of the Zo tribe. So while a large number of Chins, which are also Zo and have ethnic relationship with the Mizos, there was no real problem in the sense that the Mizos accommodated them. In fact, at one point of time, there were nearly 40,000 of them. But in Manipur, they were all being arrested and put in jail. So that's how our legal battle began. Unfortunately, as Colin mentioned, the Guwahati High Court was very, very sympathetic and also liberal in its reading of the Constitution and the state obligation to international law. And though UNHCR was not and is still not a body of the UN, the treaty has not been signed or ratified by till date. But it said, the judgment in Guwahati High Court said, and that set up the precedent, which is even now in case of a few Burmese refugees, the Manipur bench, Impal bench of the High Court has referred to, that these people should be sent to Delhi to UNHCR under state protection for the UNHCR to determine their status. So inter alia, the High Court had recognized that the UNHCR has the primary role in determining the status of refugees or their refugee status, people who come seeking refuge in India. Now that judgment was in fact a great judgment, and it was followed by several other judgments which gave the refugees a foothold. Not a strong legal foothold, but nonetheless a foothold. The second thing that also happened in those days was that the UNHCR certificate or the refugee card was recognized by the FRRO, the legal authority to determine foreigners in the country, and they gave them long-term residence permit. So it was the second legal foothold. But see, there are two aspects. One is law, the government and the political party. And the other is the host community. But see, both are unfortunately in India increasingly become hostile to refugees. And that is the problem that the Rohingyas are facing. Because today, even say 7 or 8 years ago, the Rohingyas did not feel so much pressure as they're facing it today. And that is because of the BJP, the way the BJP has been able to spread this anti or hatred against Muslims among a large sections of our people, both middle class, lower middle class, and working people and poor people in rural areas. And as many of us know, how the violence against the Muslim community has increased, and even in the national capital of Delhi, earlier in February this year, what we saw, last year, sorry. Now, the problem is that in a situation like this, like for example in Jammu, the lead against the Rohingya refugee was not taken by the state or the police. It was taken by the local community, particularly people who are aligned to the BJP ideology. All the argument that the state has brought before the courts that the Rohingyas are involved in criminal activity is incorrect, because there is no, when you look at the statistics, national crime statistics, or get the data from Jammu, also from Hyderabad and in Delhi, there is really no case against them. The Rohingyas are not involved in this country in criminal activity. They are in fact here seeking refuge, wanting to go back. And in the meantime, as the Indian state does not provide any kind of assistance to the poor, they also don't receive. So they live in like thousands and hundreds of thousands of poor people who come from rural areas to the cities, who do all kinds of daily work, including collecting garbage, separating garbage, which is what the Rohingyas are doing mostly, the lowest kind of thing. From there to daily what you call hamal, all kinds of things. In some parts, they are doing cycle rickshaw driving. They're not engaged in any kind of crime. As a community, if you look at their history, in Myanmar, from where they were thrown out, the Rohingyas have been one of the most peaceful communities in the Arakan, or what they call Rakhine state now. There are really the only violence in which they were involved is they were always in the receiving end from the state. So Rohingyas have a history of being a peaceful community. And yet, this canard against them has been politically motivated, being spread in all the areas. And when in Bangalore, they said these are people whom we don't want, they're potentially criminal. Now they're saying potentially criminal potential threat to our national security. So everything is potential. I could be a potential threat to India's national security unless you can prove it, unless you can show my involvement. I am not. So you can't say just because someone, look at someone and say, oh, he is a potential thief. There is no argument against it. And the courts should not accept that kind of an argument. But unfortunately, the courts are listening to those kind of arguments. And what's the basis of saying this? Oh, intelligence reports. Now, say intelligence reports, who's gathering this? How it was gathered? What is the background? Nothing comes. So this is the problem that we are facing. I work with some of the Rohingya groups, and I know in Delhi they have suffered badly, though fortunately during the communal riots, Rohingya settlements were not directly attacked in Northeast Delhi, but they have suffered enormously, particularly in Madanpur Khadar, where there has been series of fires in which hundreds of Rohingyas have been reduced. I mean, even now we are dealing with 56 families who lost everything and trying to stitch something together. So as I was saying, that they live in the most marginal areas, building juggies, temporary shelters, shanties, like hundreds of thousands of Indians are poor who do similar kind of work. I've been to these colonies in South Delhi, in Madanpur, backside of Jamia Millia, also across the border in Faizabad. These are mixed. They're not just, only Rohingyas who are living in those shanty towns or juggi towns, as we call them, Rohingyas, along with people from UP, from Bihar, from parts of Haryana, who have no livelihood in their rural areas. So they have come, like the migrant workers, as we call them. The state's attitude, because of the state's attitude, in fact, now the Rohingyas who earlier, under the various laws, frankly speaking, Supreme Court has laid down the law that people, it's not only citizens, the state is responsible for protecting the life of all persons. And all persons have the rights, mostly under our fundamental rights chapter. So, right to education, for example. Right to education, legally speaking and constitutionally speaking, is available to all people in this country. Until recently, it was possible. Afghan refugees, Burmese refugees who had come in the 80s, we could help them get admission in schools, in colleges, on the basis of production of their educational certificates. Some of them went all the way up to Jawaharlal University and studied there. One of these refugees, a young boy, one of the hijackers actually, Sumi went back after the restoration of democracy, and Sumi started a newspaper in Myanmar, in Rangoon, and Mizima. And Mizima has been doing very well. So if you look at, there are some very good success stories of refugees in the 80s and 90s. Post arrival of the BJP at the center, refugees, particularly Muslim refugees, have become a specific target. And as the state has made them targets, the host community, in which there are lots of BJP supporters, are also become very anti. So admission of Rohingya children in schools is becoming difficult. Getting them healthcare in government hospitals becoming difficult. So these are the areas where we work. We try and get the children into schools. We have started, in fact, a few schools, not really schools as such, but coaching. But there are, we take in all the Rohingya children, and we try to give them some basic education following the curriculum of the Indian board. And in some of these areas, particularly in Northeast Delhi, it's not just the Rohingya children who attend those schools. It is the children of the local poor who live in those shanties along with the Rohingya. So, but getting education is, as I said, regular education for the children of the refugees, Rohingya particularly, is become very difficult and perhaps will become more difficult unless something changes. Healthcare again is a problem, as someone pointed out. I think it was Amal who pointed out that when he had gone there, he found that there was no healthcare was available. No healthcare is available in the Jhuggi towns in India, as we know. But when they land up in a government hospital, they usually get whatever these hospitals provide. And some of them are pretty good, there is no doubt about it. But being denied to access those hospitals, particularly in state of Haryana, in Jammu Kashmir, Hyderabad has not been so difficult so far. It is a problem. So pregnancy, problems of lactating mother, care for newborns, perinatal problems. None of these are now available. And they can't afford to go to private hospitals. So that is one area where we are really under a lot of pressure. The second thing is also, unfortunately, West Bengal is a state where the refugees who are, and West Bengal is a state which has in the past been very helpful and welcoming to refugees. But I do not know why, under the TMC government, the Rohingya refugees in Myanmar, in West Bengal, has had a difficult time, and they're still facing very difficult time. Large number of them are in jail for years, and through Collins HRLN, and also privately, motivating and local human rights organizations like Masoom and EPDR, we've been able to get some of them released. But the problem remains that often even these courts don't recognize the UNHCR certificate and hand them over to FRRO. Now, when that happens, the FRRO is following, as you know, the policy of deportation. And that is the real problem we are also facing for the Rohingyas, because the Supreme Court, particularly Chief Justice Gogoi, had done a great job. I don't know why he did that, but he went against all the judgments of the Supreme Court and the High Court, and they established, as we say, the case law. He just threw them out of the window and agreed that since India is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, India is not obliged to follow it, which is absolutely wrong.
Sir, could you just wrap up?
Pardon?
Sir, could you just wrap up? I have other speakers also.
Okay.
And yeah.
So this is a very serious situation the refugees, Rohingyas particularly, are facing. And now that a potential influx of Afghan refugees are looming in the background, I don't know how the Indian state will, though they are saying that they will accommodate, one is not very clear how far they will stand by their commitment. So I think what is critically important is that we get more and more people in India to take the refugee issue and try and get people to accept them and not, follow the state policy of saying all refugees are possible criminals and potential. And if they're Muslim, potential threat to our national security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for identifying issues, areas of concern. And I think one important issue that has to be raised here is the source of misinformation about Rohingyas. Media plays an important role in spreading misinformation, especially the TVs like Republic TV and others. I think I have a contributed chapter in one of my books on Rohingyas about the role of media on Rohingyas, and subsequently also I have contributed a chapter in Irudia Rajan's book, the role of the portrayal of Rohingyas in media. Especially, I have taken the Republic TV and all other TVs that have portrayed a negative image of Rohingyas, and that has contributed to the formation of identity of Rohingyas among the Indians. So that issue also has to be taken up in some way or the other, because that remains a very important source of misinformation. And with these words, I request Dr. Priyanka Mathur I think if you can introduce yourself, that will be better. She is an associate professor at the Center for Research in Social Sciences and Education, Jain University in Bangalore, and an international trainer with Forum for Federation for its work in Myanmar. I'm just giving this introduction, but if you can say something more about you, because you are involved in so many issues, because I know you from so different sources. We have commonalities, starting from MCRG to Jain University to CSTS Lokaniti. So please, if you can introduce yourself and deliberate the issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishwajit. First of all, thank you to the organizers, to Institute of Statelessness Inclusion, APRIN, everyone involved in having me here on this panel. It's really an honor to speak after Tapanda, such a stalwart in our field. We all know him for so many years, and good to have Fazal also here with me here on this panel. A disclaimer, I'm actually taking the place here of Ravi. Ravi was supposed to be here, but unfortunately he has to undergo a cardiac surgery. So he requested me that if I can also, join the panel. I said, okay, and be very happy to do that. My tryst, with refugee and forced migration studies goes back to more than 2 decades, when I was an MPhil scholar at the Center for Political Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, way back in 1997-99. And my thesis at that time at CPS was one of the first ones ever which looked at the normative study of IDPs and refugees in India. And in fact, I remember as an academic researcher being so bogged down because there was no literature on refugees in India. Other than one edited volume, there was just nothing. And that's when you realize that here is a field of marginalized groups in society, in the world, and particularly in a country like India, which really needs attention. And it felt really good a couple of days ago when I saw my MPhil thesis of more than 2 decades old being cited somewhere, and that was really nice. But let me come back, and I see so many of my friends from APRIN and everywhere in the audience here. So I've been working in the field of refugee studies and migration for over 2 decades, but particularly my work with Rohingyas started when I was the MA coordinator of the political science department at St. Joseph's College in Bengaluru. I lived in Delhi for 20 years, and then I moved to Bangalore 10 years ago. And that's when a student of mine and I did a particular project with MCRG on Rohingya refugees in Hyderabad. And subsequently, a chapter was published in the Routledge edition, edited book there. And that was the first time I stepped into the Rohingya camps in Hyderabad and saw the pitiable conditions that they were in. Yes, all the panelists till now have spoken about their terrible conditions of health, sanitation, and livelihoods that they live in. I really want to just disagree and say one small point here. The people that I have spoken to, particularly Rohingyas, none of them have really ever told me that they really want to go back because they were fleeing terrible conditions in Myanmar. And the only reason why they live in India in quiet solitude is because of their humble submission that, you know what, at least here we are alive and we are managing little food and something to just stay alive. They know that the condition back in Myanmar is really, really terrible. And I'll come back to that point because in my role as a consultant from 2016 onwards, I've also had the opportunity to visit Myanmar many times, many of the states, and you know, as a trainer on federalism. I've also visited the Rakhine Island, you know, and we had a particular training there, which unfortunately got cancelled. And in half a day only, we were asked to leave. When you're inside Myanmar, and I want to begin with that snippet, we don't even mention the R word. We don't even speak about the Rohingya. You can't call them by their name because, as we all are aware of it, that from 1982, they were expelled as citizens in their constitution. And that is the real condition of them back in that country. You know, I really feel unfortunate that because of my stint inside the country in Myanmar, I was able to see what is it there, the Burman superiority, the majoritarianism of the Burman community, which totally, you know, kind of looks down at the minority groups there. They just don't exist there. And of course, the atrocities, you know, with the army and the terrible ethnic genocide that has forced them for decades now, you know, to flee and be the most persecuted minority in the world. After that, now and particularly in Bangalore, let me take you straight back to last year. That was the time when the pandemic started. And I'm here right now as an associate professor at Jain University. I have PhD scholars who are under my supervision. And one of my PhD students is a 65-year-old lady, Shukla Bose, who runs an NGO for, you know, urban slum children. And she called me up because she had managed to get rations for, you know, the slum areas where her children were working. And she told me, Priyanka ma'am, there are these Rohingya refugees who are near Hebbal. There are 2 colonies there. Do you think I should take some food for them because my trucks are going there? I said, Shukladi, please do that. Go. I had also meanwhile gotten in touch with the UNHCR office in Chennai, and they were absolutely, they just kind of put their hands up saying this was the first wave of the pandemic when we were in the first lockdown in India. And they were like, you know, Priyanka, there's nothing we can do from here. So whatever you can do, it will be really good. And we weren't, of course, nobody was really stepping out other than the relief work that was happening with the NGOs. And Shukladi called me back the next day evening saying, ma'am, the condition is terrible. Our vans, which carried food to those 2 colonies, we were completely kind of ransacked because we thought that there'd be 5 or 6 people in any house. And in their houses, there are around 10 or 12 of them packed, and they have received no ration, nothing from the government or from anybody else at all. Now, that is something that really stayed with me. I know during the pandemic last year, many of the NGO communities and all of us in our personal capacities also try to reach out with rations and all to them. But then now let's cut back to this year when this vaccination program started. And someone with that asked me to, you know, speak a little bit about this vaccine nationalism that is happening in our country. Of course, again, Shukladi with her NGO called me to say that, you know, we've gotten some funds and I've gotten a bunch of Pfizer vaccines. Do you think we can ask that community to also come in to, you know, the schools where we are giving the vaccines, and can we vaccinate them? Again, I reached out to the UNHCR Chennai office. I reached out to the NGO partners here who are working with those groups. And well, you'll be surprised to hear this, but the Save the Children partnering with UNHCR Chennai told me that recently, and this is as of last month, the CoWIN app has a new feature which allows Rohingyas as one of the groups, refugees as one of the groups with no documentation to come under the government vaccination program. And I was given assurance, I'm still to get back into the field there to figure out what exactly is happening, but I was given assurance with the Save the Children partners of the UNHCR office in Chennai that the 250 people who are there in that particular colony in Hebbal in North Bengaluru are in the process of getting vaccinated, and half of them have been. This is, of course, not at all to draw any traction away from the terrible legal condition and the threat to life and security that they are living in the conditions of the Indian state right now. But very often when we are looking at North India, we do forget that there are some small pockets in South India where there are Rohingyas too, and they are living in these conditions. Now, at this point, I just want to play a very small 2-minute video to highlight the condition of this particular group here. Coming back to the narrative that I was weaving and trying to talk to you all about. Yes, healthcare, other services, livelihood conditions are all in a very, very pitiable conditions for refugee groups in India, and have always been because of the absence of any legal framework within which these groups live here. And Rohingyas is particularly pitiable given the current condition in Myanmar ever since the 1st February group, the coup happening there and Myanmar closing down. For me, I think so the solution and the answer will never lie with the state. We may do our legal, advocacy. We may always look at the courts for rights. At the end of the day, there will be battles that we win. But the larger battle is that of daily living. And that is something which only civil society organizations and NGOs and each one of us as human beings can come together to help these groups. I know for sure, and I'm sure many of my colleagues here who've also interacted with the UNHCR offices in India will agree with me, that at every and any occasion, the UNHCR in India has always said that its hands are tied, it doesn't have funding, it doesn't have access, and there isn't much that they can do. And whatever they can do is always very limited. The onus lies completely on us. I would really, echo the point that was said in the earlier session, that, the fact that it's up to humanity of all of us. If each one of us take care of each other, that is only when we are going to all together live in a comfortable way in the pandemic and the post-pandemic world that we find ourselves in. Multinational agencies, non-governmental organizations need to come together with greater solidarity than ever before in the times of the pandemic. We have seen how they have particularly impacted marginalized groups like women and children and migrants and refugees. Very often, it is these refugees that really fall through these gray areas and these gaps because they are the other which have perpetually been othered in the nation state narrative of the nation and the citizens and the us and the them. It is even more imperative for us from this humanitarian perspective to keep talking about them, to keep discoursing about them, to highlight their human rights conditions, to keep arguing for their legal space, and to look at how we can put services at their end. And I would like to take this opportunity amongst this August group that we have here today to ensure and to ask that we need to do more scoping studies to look at where all the Rohingyas are in much more smaller pockets, particularly in South India, so that we can put forth their concerns in a more consolidated manner. Biswajit, I'll just leave it to this at this point, and I'll be happy to take more questions and comments later on.
Yeah, thank you for very interesting discussion that we ensued, where your vivid portrayal of the camp in that short video that reminds me of the camp situation where refugees stay when I visited Kalni Kunj and other areas during or before this pandemic, and it looks like a biosocial sphere where people are reduced to biological matrix. And not only that, that is also a kind of space where disposability of object and human, they stay together. That means they can be disposed like objects, material objects. So that camp resembles this biosocial sphere where human beings and the hazardous objects, they stay together. And not only that, but also the state, as you rightly mentioned, creates a kind of spasmodic acts where they feel that this operation is an operation about disposability of people who do not matter to the state. So this whole issue of disposability and agnopolitical expression of power, that leads to what is called necropolitics, which means that people can the sovereign, the state, make the people live, and simultaneously they also make people die in that same space. So thank you for this interesting video that you shared and your observation on Rohingyas during the pandemic. Thank you. With these words, I request Mr. Fazli Ahmad to share his thought for us. Dr. Fazli is just a minute. Let me. He is an advocate and senior legal consultant at Social Legal Information Center, and he has an enriching 7 years of experience in the human rights litigation, especially in refugee rights. He has represented UNHCR recognized refugees from different communities at various courts and forums in India. So with these words, I request Mr. Fazal Abdelli to share his ideas to our participants. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Fazal Abdali. Very precise about it. I'm practicing in several high courts and Supreme Court on the issues of the refugee. A lot has been changing, and government goes towards the Rohingya change. In 2017, when a PIL was filed in Jammu and Kashmir High Court by a person named Hunar Gupta.
Fazal, your audio is coming a little stuck. Your audio is not coming very clearly, Fazal.
Okay, just a second. Is it audible now? Better?
Yeah, little better, yes.
Yes, little better, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just say that in 2017, January, until then the refugees were getting long-term visas, were recognized as refugees. Rohingyas got a bit of facilities by the government and were getting livelihood options in many of the states. When Mr. Hunar Gupta filed a PIL in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court, saying and asking evacuation of all the Rohingyas from Jammu. Post that, there was a lot of statements given by the politicians and individuals saying that there are 80,000 Rohingyas in Jammu, 1 lakh Rohingyas in Jammu, which resulted in big banners and posters identify and kill Rohingyas in Jammu by Chamber of Commerce. In same year, August, there was an order issued by the government saying that identify and deport the Rohingyas from India. That exactly changed a lot of protection scenario for the Rohingyas pan-India. A debate was started that these are illegal immigrants. However, in one day, if you look into the details of the Rohingyas, they were given long-term visa until August 2017. And after the issuance of the order by the government, they were turned illegal immigrants overnight. And thereafter, the sufferings and the miseries were highlighted by every other groups. Rohingyas are the only group which lives in India in a very inhuman condition. The shanties which are being built by them are of cardboard, tarpaulin, and bamboos, which is very prone to the fire incidents. And eventually, since 2016, a lot of fire incidents happening in the Rohingya settlements. These are the overview. And in 2013, if I may say, that we went to the settlements and found out that there were no supply of clean drinking water, access to education and other basic facilities. And when we went to the court and filed that petition, it took government and the Supreme Court to give an order equal to the citizen. All the basic necessities and facilities which the citizens of India is available for the Rohingyas. It was earlier said by Colin that the practical of this is that these services were limitedly Rohingya. Now, the pandemic started in 2000. The pandemic started in 2000. The became worse. There was no supply of any aid initially.
Hi Fazan, sorry to disturb you. Your network bandwidth is low. Maybe you could consider turning off your video and then trying, because your audio is also getting a bit distorted. Thanks.
Hello, am I audible now?
Yes, little
Yeah,
better.
Okay.
Could
So
you
I was
could you just hold your microphone into your mouth so that nearer. Yeah.
Okay. So in 2020, when the first lockdown started, the Rohingyas were the most vulnerable condition where there was no aid. Because if we talk about the Rohingyas who were residing in Delhi, there was a protest going on in 2019, due to which a lot of Rohingyas didn't get out of their settlement to get the livelihood option. Post that, when the lockdown was started, they didn't have much to eat or not even able to pay for clean drinking water. So these situations were brought in notice to the subdivisional magistrate through a representation. However, the magistrate did not respond. Thereafter, subsequently in 2020, we filed a petition in the Delhi High Court for the implementation of the court order of Jafarullah. Once the petition was filed, the Delhi government provided dry ration to the Rohingya community in Delhi itself. Subsequently, thereafter, some aid was provided by the UNHCR. However, these aids were not adequate because even after the first lockdown, the Rohingyas were not getting livelihood option. We tried and bring that in the notice of the court as well as the subdivisional magistrate, who is the nodal officer for Rohingyas. But after representing the magistrate did not properly responded to the crisis. The huge issue with the Rohingya was education. Now the government announced that everything is online. But when we went to the settlements, we saw that a family having 3 children, bright students, was not able to attend the classes because one, the family has only mobile and it can to the eldest first. And once he has done with his education or the classes, then if there are classes for the younger children, the mobile will be given to them. Due to which the dropout rates in the Rohingya community became very high. Secondly, now they were demanding that if we are getting the livelihood option, we have to take this mobile and go out and work. So the family was left with no option to study. The children were forced to accommodate or to work with the rather than getting education on the mobile. When we went and see that what happened to the foods and ration, does the family has it or not during the pandemic? The was having a very limited ration by the individual donors or the NGOs, but not by the government. However, if you look into the Article 21, the Article 21 clearly says that right to life is for everyone. And when it includes the dry ration situation of pandemic, we surveyed the whole country and saw every other refugee community was facing the same problem. We filed a petition in the Supreme Court asking for universal distribution rations to other refugees in India. That is yet to be heard to get an order in the same. However, we are expecting that the Supreme Court will be considerate in providing basic facilities again to the refugee community. Now, when we come to the health, in Hyderabad, very recently, we saw that some of these people had severe health conditions post-lockdown, but the issues are not being treated by the government hospitals. The are rejecting at times their claims because they are refugees and does not possess Aadhaar card. Some of the cases, some were the without Aadhaar card, it is not available in practice. In Hyderabad, Delhi, and Jaipur, there are drives for the vaccination, which is going on for refugees. That is because the government of India issued a notification stating that any person who does not have any document will also be vaccinated. And when that was the advocacy was raised with the government, they gave an access to vaccination to the refugees. However, the pace is slow. And it is not only slow for the Rohingyas or the refugees, it's slow for everyone, which has to be expedited because the third wave, which has been maybe coming in the October or so, and the worst affected with the will be the Rohingyas or the refugees who are living in a condition where they're living in a scarce situation. These are compact. They are living very close. If one gets affected, the whole that particular in Faridabad, we saw some fear of if they tested positive for COVID, they will be and there will be no one to take care of the family, and the family will be at the verge of the starvation. So there are multiple issues with the community, which is going the COVID. One, there's lack of livelihood option. Second, there is still fear if the head of the family get affected with the COVID, he doesn't get tested because there will be no option of ration of food for the community. Third, the education is one of the biggest challenge. Fourth, the protection environment where the detention is there in the Jammu, and in the detention camp, there are 61 refugees who have been tested positive. Fifth, there is a threat for deportation, and there is random detention going on in Pan-India where the refugees are being targeted and they have been arbitrarily detained. Sixth is, there is one problem which came across in Hyderabad where the refugees claimed that have made the Aadhaar card, and when the government asked them to submit and surrender it, they did it 2 years back, but now they have been arrested on same offense. So that we have to look into a mode, how do we tackle these kind of issues legally? By this, I would like to end my session, and if there is any question, I'll be happy to take.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Fazal, for this interesting talk on everyday life of Rohingyas, where they live a kind of insufficient life, where health, education, welfare schemes, and during pandemic, the ration and all these they have been denied to them. The welfare schemes have been denied to them, and how law plays becomes an instrument of this kind of exception, where the refugees are deliberately left out from the whole humanity.
So much. Thank you for joining us, and we'd like to thank the audience for listening to us and for being a part of this